Section 24 of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Ellison. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by A.G. Carter. Section 24, Volume 2, Chapter 11, Through the Mountains, Part 2. Our original intention of starting again as soon as the sledges were ready was abandoned. We did not lose very much by this. On the contrary, we gained on the whole. The dogs, the most important factor of all, had a thorough rest and were well fed. They had undergone a remarkable change since our arrival at the butcher's shop. They now wandered about, fat, sleek, and contented, and their former voracity had completely disappeared. As regards ourselves, a day or two longer made no difference. Our most important article of diet, the pemmican, was practically left untouched. As for the time being, dog had completely taken its place. There was thus no great sign of depression to be noticed when we came back into the tent after finishing our work and had to while away the time. As I went in, I could descry Wisting a little way off, kneeling on the ground, and engaged in the manufacture of cutlets. The dogs stood in a ring round him and looked on with interest. The northeast wind whistled and howled, the air was thick with driving snow, and Wisting was not to be envied. But he managed his work well, and we got our dinner as usual. During the evening the wind moderated a little, and went more to the east. We went to sleep with the best hopes for the following day. Saturday, November 25th came. It was a grand day in many respects. I had already seen proofs on several occasions of the kind of men my comrades were, but their conduct that day was such that I shall never forget it, to whatever age I may live. In the course of the night the wind had gone back to the north and increased to a gale. It was blowing and snowing so that, when we came out in the morning, we could not see the sledges. They were half snowed under. The dogs had crept together and protected themselves as well as they could against the blizzard. The temperature was not so very low, -16.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but low enough to be disagreeably felt in a storm. We had all taken a turn outside to look at the weather, and were sitting on our sleeping bags discussing the poor prospect. "It's the devil's own weather here at the butcher's," said one. "It looks to me as if it would never get any better. This is the 5th day, and it's blowing worse than ever." We all agreed. "There's nothing so bad as lying weather-bound like this," continued another. "It takes more out of you than going from morning to night." Personally, I was of the same opinion. One day may be pleasant enough, but 2, 3, 4, and now, as it seemed, 5 days, no, it was awful. Shall we try it? No sooner was the proposal submitted than it was accepted unanimously and with acclamation. When I think of my 4 friends on the southern journey, it is the memory of that morning that comes first to my mind. All the qualities that I most admire in a man were clearly shown at that juncture: courage and dauntlessness, without boasting or big words. Amid joking and chaff, everything was packed, and then out into the blizzard. It was practically impossible to keep one's eyes open. The fine drift snow penetrated everywhere, and at times one had a feeling of being blind. The tent was not only drifted up, but covered with ice, and in taking it down we had to handle it with care, so as not to break it in pieces. The dogs were not much inclined to start, and it took time to get them into their harness, but at last we were ready. One more glance over the camping ground to see that nothing we ought to have with us had been forgotten. The 14 dogs' carcasses that were left were piled up in a heap, and Hassel's sledge was set up against it as a mark. The spare sets of dog harness, some alpine ropes, and all our crampons for ice work, which we now thought would not be required, were left behind. The last thing to be done was planting a broken ski upright by the side of the depot. It was Wisting who did this, thinking presumably that an extra mark would do no harm. That it was a happy thought the future will show. And then we were off. It was a hard pole to begin with, both for men and beasts, as the high sastrugi continued towards the south and made it extremely difficult to advance. Those who had sledges to drive had to be very attentive and support them so that they did not capsize on the big waves, and we who had no sledges found great difficulty in keeping our feet, as we had nothing to lean against. We went on like this, slowly enough, but the main thing was that we made progress. The ground at first gave one the impression of rising, though not much. The going was extremely heavy. It was like dragging oneself through sand. Meanwhile, the sastrugi grew smaller and smaller, and finally they disappeared altogether, and the surface became quite flat. The going also improved by degrees. For what reason it is difficult to say, as the storm continued unabated, and the drift, now combined with falling snow, was thicker than ever. It was all the driver could do to see his own dogs. The surface, which had become perfectly level, had the appearance at times of sinking. In any case, one would have thought so from the pace of the sledges. Now and again, the dogs would set off suddenly at a gallop. The wind aft, no doubt, helped the pace somewhat, but it alone could not account for the change. I did not like this tendency of the ground to fall away. In my opinion, we ought to have done with anything of that sort after reaching the height at which we were. A slight slope upward, possibly, but down, no, that did not agree with my reckoning. So far the incline had not been so great as to cause uneasiness, but if it seriously began to go downhill, we should have to stop and camp. To run down at a full gallop, blindly and in complete ignorance of the ground, would be madness. We might risk falling into some chasm before we had time to pull up. Amundsen, as usual, was driving first. Strictly speaking, I should now have been going in advance, but the uneven surface at the start, and the rapid pace afterwards, had made it impossible to walk as fast the dogs could pull. I was therefore following by the side of Wisting's sledge and chatting with him. Suddenly I saw Hansen's dogs shoot ahead, and downhill they went at the wildest pace. Wisting after them. I shouted to Hansen to stop, and he succeeded in doing so by twisting his sledge. The others, who were following, stopped when they came up to him. We were in the middle of a fairly steep descent. What there might be below was not easy to decide, nor would we try to find out in that weather. Was it possible that we were on our way down through the mountains again? It seemed more probable that we lay on one of the numerous ridges, but we could not be sure of nothing before the weather cleared. We trampled down a place for the tent in the loose snow, and soon got it up. It was not a long day's march that we had done, 11 3/4 miles, but we had put an end to our stay at the butcher's shop, and that was a great thing. The boiling point test that evening showed that we were 10,300 feet above the sea, and that we had thus gone down 620 feet from the butcher's. We turned in and went to sleep. As soon as it brightened, we should have been ready to jump out and look at the weather. One has to seize every opportunity in these regions. If one neglects to do so, it may mean a long wait and much may be lost. We therefore all slept with one eye open, and we knew well that nothing could happen without our noticing it. At 3 a.m, the sun cut through the clouds, and we through the tent door. To take in the situation was more than the work of a moment. The sun showed as yet like a pat of butter, and had not succeeded in dispersing the thick mists. The wind had dropped somewhat, but was still fairly strong. This is, after all, the worst part of one's job, turning out of one's good, warm sleeping bag, and standing outside for some time in thin clothes, watching the weather. We knew by experience that a gleam like this, a clearing in the weather, might come suddenly, and then one had to be on the spot. The gleam came. It did not last long, but long enough. We lay on the side of the ridge that fell away pretty steeply. The descent on the south was too abrupt, but on the southeast it was better and more gradual, and ended in a wide, level tract. We could see no crevasses or unpleasantness of any kind. It was not very far that we could see, though, only our nearest surroundings. Of the mountains we saw nothing, neither Fridtjof Nansen nor Don Pedro Christophersen. Well content with our morning's work, we turned in again and slept till 6 a.m., when we began our morning preparations. The weather, which had somewhat improved during the night, had now broken loose again, and the northeaster was doing all it could. However, it would take more than a storm and snow to stop us now, since we had discovered the nature of our immediate surroundings. If we once got down to the plain, we knew that we could always feel our way on. After putting ample brakes on the sledge runners, we started off downhill in a southeasterly direction. The slight idea of the position that we had been able to get in the morning proved correct. The descent was easy and smooth, and we reached the plain without any adventure. We could now once more set our faces to the south, and in thick driving snow we continued our way into the unknown, with good assistance from the howling northeasterly gale. We now recommenced the erection of beacons, which had not been necessary during the ascent. In the course of the forenoon we again passed over a little ridge, the last of them that we encountered. The surface was now fine enough, smooth as a floor, and without a sign of sastrugi. If our progress was nevertheless slow and difficult, this was due to the wretched going, which was real torture to all of us. A sledge journey through the Sahara could not have offered a worse surface to move over. Now the forerunners came into their own, and from here to the pole, Hassel and I took it in turns to occupy the position. The weather improved in the course of the day, and when we camped in the afternoon it looked quite smiling. The sun came through and gave a delightful warmth after the last few bitter days. It was not yet clear, so that we could see nothing of our surroundings. The distance, according to our 3 sledge meters, was 18.5 miles. Taking the bad going into consideration, we had reason to be well satisfied with it. Our altitude came out at 9,475 feet above the sea, or a drop of 825 feet in the course of the day. This surprised me greatly. What did it mean? Instead of rising gradually, we were going slowly down. Something extraordinary must await us further on, but what? According to dead reckoning, our latitude that evening was 86 degrees south. November 27 did not bring us the desired weather. The night was filled with sharp gusts from the north. The morning came with a slack wind, but accompanied by mist and snowfall. This was abominable. Here we were, advancing over absolutely virgin ground and able to see nothing. The surface remained about the same, possibly rather more undulating. That it had been blowing here at some time, and violently too, was shown by the undersurface, which was composed of sastrugi as hard as iron. Luckily for us, the snowfall of the last few days had filled these up, so as to present a level surface. It was heavy going, though better than on the previous day. As we were advancing, still blindly, and fretting at the persistently thick weather, one of us suddenly called out, "Hullo, look there!" A wild, dark summit rose high out of the mass of fog to the east-southeast. It was not far away. On the contrary, it seemed threateningly near and right over us. We stopped and looked at the imposing sight. But nature did not expose her objects of interest for long. The fog rolled over again, thick, heavy, and dark, and blotted out the view. We knew now that we had to be prepared for surprises. After we had gone about 10 miles, the fog again lifted for a moment, and we saw quite near, a mile or so away, 2 long, narrow mountain ridges to the west of us, running north and south, and completely covered with snow. These, Helland Hansen's mountains, were the only ones we saw on our right hand during the march on the plateau. They were between 9,000 and 10,000 feet high, and would probably serve as excellent landmarks on the return journey. There was no connection to be traced between these mountains and those lying to the east of them. They gave us the impression of being entirely isolated summits, as we could not make out any lofty ridge running east and west. We continued our course in the constant expectation of finding some surprise or other in our line of route. The air ahead of us was as black as pitch, as though it concealed something. It could not be a storm, or it would have been already upon us. But we went on, and nothing came. Our day's march was 18.5 miles. I see that my diary for November 28 does not begin very promisingly. Fog, fog, and again fog. Also fine falling snow, which makes the going impossible. Poor beasts, they have toiled hard to get the sledges forward today, but the day did not turn out so badly after all. As we worked our way out of this uncertainty and found out what was behind the pitch-dark clouds, during the forenoon the sun came through and thrust aside the fog for a while, and there, to the southeast, not many miles away, lay an immense mountain mass. From this mass, right across our course, ran a great ancient glacier. The sun shone down upon it and showed us a surface full of huge irregularities. On the side nearest to the mountain, these disturbances were such that a hasty glance was enough to show us the impossibility of advancing that way. But right in our line of route, straight on to the glacier, it looked, as far as we could see, as though we could get along. The fog came and went, and we had to take advantage of the clear intervals to get our bearings. It would, no doubt, have been better if we could have halted, set up our tent, and waited for decently clear weather, so that we might survey the ground at our ease and choose the best way. Going forward without an idea of what the ground was like was not very pleasant. But how long should we have to wait for clear weather? That question was unanswerable, possibly a week, or even a fortnight, and we had no time for that. Better go straight on, then, and take what might come. What we could see of the glacier appeared to be pretty steep, but it was only between the south and southeast, under the new land, that the fog now and again lifted sufficiently to enable us to see anything. From the south round to the west the fog lay as thick as gruel. We could see that the big crevasses lost themselves in it, and the question of what the glacier looked like on the west had to be put aside for the moment. It was to the south we had to go, and there it was possible to go forward a little way. We continued our march until the ground began to show. It was our intention to lighten our sledges before tackling the glacier. From the little we could see of it, it was plain enough that we should have stiff work. It was therefore important to have as little as possible on the sledges. We set to work at once to build the depot. The snow here was excellent for this purpose, as hard as glass. In a short time, an immense erection of adamantine blocks of snow rose into the air, containing provisions for 5 men for 6 days and for 18 dogs for 5 days. A number of small articles were also left behind. While we were thus occupied, the fog had been coming and going. Some of the intervals had been quite clear, and had given me a good view of the nearest part of the range. It appeared to be quite isolated, and to consist of 4 mountains. One of these, Mount Helmer Hansen, lay separated from the rest. The other 3, Mounts Oscar Wisting, Sevre Hassel, and Olav Bjalland, lay closer together. Behind this group the air had been heavy and black the whole time, showing that more land must be concealed there. Suddenly, in one of the brightest intervals, there came a rift in this curtain, and the summits of the colossal mountain mass appeared. Our first impression was that this mountain, Mount Thorvald Nilsen, must be something over 20,000 feet high. It positively took our breath away, so formidable did it appear. But it was only a glimpse that we had, and then the fog enclosed it once more. We had succeeded in taking a few meager bearings of the different summits of the nearest group, They were not very grand, but better ones were not to be obtained. For that matter, the site of the depot was so well marked by its position under the foot of the glacier that we agreed it would be impossible to miss it. Having finished the edifice, which rose at least 6 feet into the air, we put one of our black provision cases on top of it, so as to be able to see it still more easily on the way back. An observation we had contrived to take while the work was in progress gave us our latitude as 16 degrees 21 minutes south. This did not agree very well with the latitude of our dead reckoning, 86 degrees 23 minutes south. Meanwhile, the fog again enveloped everything, and a fine, light snow was falling. We had taken a bearing of the line of glacier that was most free of crevasses, and so we moved on again. It was some time before we felt our way up the glacier. The crevasses at its foot were not large, but we had no sooner entered upon the ascent than the fun began. There was something uncanny about this perfectly blind advance among crevasses and chasms on all sides. We examined the compass from time to time, and went forward cautiously. Hassel and I went in front on a rope, but that, after all, was not much of a help to our drivers. We naturally glided lightly on our ski over places where the dogs would easily fall through. The lowest part of the glacier was not entirely free from danger, as the crevasses were often rendered quite invisible by a thin overlying layer of snow. In clear weather it was not so bad to have to cross such a surface, as the effect of light and shade is usually to show up the edges of these insidious pitfalls. But on a day like this, when everything looked alike, one's advance is doubtful. We kept it going, however, by using the utmost caution. Wisting came near to sounding the depth of one of these dangerous crevasses with sledge, dogs and all, as the bridge he was about to cross gave way. Thanks to his presence of mind and a lightning-like movement, some would call it luck, he managed to save himself. In this way we worked up about 200 feet, but then we came upon such a labyrinth of yawning chasms and open abysses that we could not move. There was nothing to be done but to find the least disturbed spot and set the tent there. As soon as this was done, Hansen and I set out to explore. We were roped and therefore safe enough. It required some study to find a way out of the trap we had run ourselves into. Towards the group of mountains last described, which now lay to the east of us, it had sufficiently cleared to give us a fairly good view of the appearance of the glacier in that direction. What we had seen before at a distance was now confirmed. The part extending to the mountains was so ground up and broken that there was positively not a spot where one could set one's foot. It looked as if a battle had been fought here, and the ammunition had been great blocks of ice. They lay pell-mell, one on top of another, in all directions, and evoked a picture of violent confusion. Thank God we were not here while this was going on, I thought to myself, as I stood looking out over this battlefield. It must have been a spectacle like doomsday, and not on a small scale either. To advance in that direction, then, was hopeless, but that was no great matter, since our way was to the south. On the south we could see nothing. The fog lay thick and heavy there. All we could do was try to make our way on, and we therefore crept southward. On leaving our tent, we had first to cross a comparatively narrow snow bridge, and then go along a ridge or saddle raised by pressure, with wide open crevasses on both sides. This ridge led us on to an ice wave about 25 feet high, or formation which was due to the pressure having ceased before the wave had been forced to break and form hummocks. We saw well enough that this would be a difficult place to pass with sledges and dogs, but in default of anything better, it would have to be done. From the top of this wave formation, we could see down on the other side, which had hitherto been hidden from us. The fog prevented our seeing far, but the immediate surroundings were enough to convince us that with caution we could beat up farther. From the height on which we stood, every precaution would be required to avoid going down on the other side, for there the wave ended in an open crevasse, specially adapted to receive any drivers, sledges, or dogs that might make a slip. The trip that Hansen and I took to the south was made entirely at random, as we saw absolutely nothing. Our object was to make tracks for the following day's journey. The language we used about the glacier as we went was not altogether complimentary. We had endless tacking and turning to get on. To go 1 yard forward, I am sure we had to go at least 10 to one side. Can anyone be surprised that we called it the Devil's Glacier? At any rate, our companions acknowledged the justness of the name with ringing acclamations when we told them of it. At Hell's Gate, Hansen and I halted. This was a very remarkable formation. The glacier had here formed a long ridge about 20 feet high. Then, in the middle of this ridge, a fissure had opened, making a gateway about 6 feet wide. This formation, like everything else on the glacier, was obviously very old, and for the most part filled with snow. From this point the glacier, as far as our view extended to the south, looked better and better. We therefore turned round and followed our tracks in the comforting conviction that we managed to get on. Our companions were no less pleased with the news we brought of our prospects. Our altitude that evening was 8,650 feet above the sea. That is to say, at the foot of the glacier we had reached an altitude of 8,450 feet, or a drop from the Butcher's of 2,570 feet. We now knew very well that we should have this ascent to make again, perhaps even more, and this idea did not arouse any particular enthusiasm. In my diary, I see that I conclude the day with the following words. What will the next surprise be, I wonder? It was, in fact, an extraordinary journey that we were undertaking, through new regions, new mountains, glaciers, and so on, without being able to see. That we were prepared for surprises was quite natural. What I liked least about this feeling one's way forward in the dark was that it could be difficult, very difficult indeed, to recognize the ground again on the way back. But with this glacier lying straight across our line of route, and with the numerous beacons we had erected, we assured ourselves on this score. It would take a good deal to make us miss them on return. The point for us, of course, was to find our descent to the barrier again. A mistake there might be serious enough. And it will appear later in this narrative that my fear of our not being able to recognize the way was not entirely groundless. The beacons we had put up came to our aid, and for our final success we owe a deep debt of gratitude to our prudence and thoughtfulness in adopting this expedient. Next morning, November 29, brought considerably clearer weather and allowed us a very good survey of our position. We could now see that the two mountain ranges uniting in 86 degrees south were continued in a mighty chain running to the southeast, with summits from 10,000 to 15,000 feet. Mount Thorvald Nilsen was the most southerly we could see from this point. Mounts Hansen, Wisting, Bjalland, and Hassel formed, as we had thought the day before, a group by themselves, and lay separated from the main ridge. The drivers had a warm morning's work. They had to drive with great circumspection and patience to grapple with the kind of ground we had before us. A slight mistake might be enough to send both sledge and dogs with lightning rapidity into the next world. It took, nevertheless, a remarkably short time to cover the distance we had explored on the previous evening. Before we knew it, we were at Hell's Gate. Bjalland took an excellent photograph here, which gives a very good idea of the difficulties this part of the journey presented. In the foreground, below the high snow ridge that forms one side of a very wide but partly filled-up crevasse, the marks of ski can be seen in the snow. This was the photographer who, in passing over this snow bridge, struck his ski into it to try the strength of the support. Close to the tracks can be seen an open piece of the crevasse. It is a pale blue at the top, but ends in the deepest black, in a bottomless abyss. The photographer got over the bridge and back with a whole skin, but there could be no question of risking sledges and dogs on it, and it can be seen in the photograph that the sledges have been turned right around to try another way. The two small black figures in the distance on the right are Hassel and I, who are reconnoitering ahead. It was no very great distance that we put behind us that day, 9¼ miles in a straight line, but, taking into account all the turns and circuits we had been compelled to make, it was not so short after all. We set our tent on a good, solid foundation, and were well pleased with the day's work. The altitude was 8,960 feet above the sea. The sun was now in the west, and shining directly upon the huge mountain masses. It was a fairy landscape in blue and white, red and black, a play of colors that defies description. Clear as it now appeared to be, one could understand that the weather was not all that could be wished, for the southeastern end of Mount Thorvald Nilsen lost itself in a dark, impenetrable cloud which led one to suspect a continuation in that direction, though one could not be certain. Mount Nilsen, anything more beautiful, taking it all together, I have never seen. Peaks of the most varied forms rose high into the air, partly covered with driving clouds. Some were sharp, but most were long and rounded. Here and there one saw bright, shining glaciers plunging wildly down the steep sides and merging into the underlying ground in fearful confusion. But the most remarkable of them all was Mount Helmer Hansen. Its top was as round as the bottom of a bowl, and covered by an extraordinary ice sheet, which was so broken up and disturbed that the blocks of ice bristled in every direction like the quills of a porcupine. It glittered and burned in the sunlight, a glorious spectacle. There could be only one such mountain in the world, and as a landmark it was priceless. We knew that we could not mistake that, however the surroundings might appear on the return journey, when possibly the conditions of lighting might be altogether different. End of section 24. Recording by Richard Ellison.
Of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by A. G. Carter. Section 25. Volume 2, Chapter 11. Through the Mountains. Part 3. After camping, two of us went out to explore farther. The prospect from the tent was not encouraging, but we might possibly find things better than we expected. We were lucky to find the going so fine as it was on the glacier. We had left our crampons behind at the butcher's shop, and if we had found smooth ice instead of a good firm snow surface, such as we now had, it would have caused us much trouble. Up, still up, among monsters of crevasses, some of them hundreds of feet wide and possibly thousands of feet deep. Our prospects of advancing were certainly not bright. As far as we could see in the line of our route, one immense ridge towered above another, concealing on their farther sides huge wide chasms which all had to be avoided. We went forward, steadily forward, though the way round was both long and troublesome. We had no rope on this time, as the irregularities were so plain that it would have been difficult to go into them. It turned out, however, at several points that the rope would not have been out of place. We were just going to cross over one of the numerous ridges, the surface here looked perfectly whole, when a great piece broke right under the back half of Hansen's ski. We could not deny ourselves the pleasure of glancing down into the hole. The sight was not an inviting one, and we agreed to avoid this place when we came on with our dogs and sledges. Every day we had occasion to bless our ski. We often used to ask each other where we should now have been without these excellent appliances. The usual answer was, most probably at the bottom of some crevasse. When we first read the different accounts of the aspect and nature of the Barrier, it was clear to all of us, who were born and bred with ski on our feet, that these must be regarded as indispensable. This view was confirmed and strengthened every day, and I am not giving too much credit to our excellent ski when I say that they not only played a very important part, but possibly the most important of all, on our journey to the South Pole. Many a time we traversed stretches of surface so cleft and disturbed that it would have been an impossibility to get over them on foot. I need scarcely insist on the advantages of ski in deep, loose snow. After advancing for 2 hours, we decided to return. From the raised ridge on which we were then standing, the surface ahead of us looked more promising than ever, but we had so often been deceived on the glacier that we had now become definitely sceptical. How often, for instance, had we thought that beyond this or that undulation our trials would be at an end, and that the way to the south would lie open and free, only to reach the place and find that the ground behind the ridge was, if possible, worse than what we had already been struggling with. But this time we seemed somehow to feel victory in the air. The formations appeared to promise it, and yet... Had we been so often deceived by these formations that we now refused to offer them a thought? Was it possibly instinct that told us this? I do not know, but certain it is that Hanssen and I agreed, as we stood there discussing our prospects, that behind the farthest ridge we saw, we should conquer the glacier. We had a feverish desire to go and have a look at it, but the way round the many crevasses was long, and, I may as well admit it, we were beginning to get tired. The return, downhill as it was, did not take long, and soon we were able to tell our comrades that the prospects of the morrow were very promising. While we had been away, Hassel had measured the Nilsen mountain and found its height to be 15,500 feet above the sea. How well I remember that evening when we stood contemplating the glorious sight that nature offered, and believing the air to be so clear that anything within range of vision must have shown itself. And how well, too, I remember our astonishment on the return journey on finding the whole landscape completely transformed. If it had not been for Mount Helmer Hansen, it would have been difficult for us to know where we were. The atmosphere in these regions may play the most awkward tricks. Absolutely clear as it seemed to us that evening, it nevertheless turned out later that it had been anything but clear. One has, therefore, to be very careful about what one sees or does not see. In most cases it has proved that travellers in the polar regions have been more apt to see too much than too little. If, however, we had charted this tract as we saw it the first time, a great part of the mountain ranges would have been omitted. During the night a gale sprang up from the southeast, and blew so that it howled in the guy ropes of the tent. It was well that the tent pegs had a good hold. In the morning, while we were at breakfast, it was still blowing, and we had some thoughts of waiting for a time. But suddenly, without warning, the wind dropped to such an extent that all our hesitation vanished. What a change the southeast wind had produced! The splendid covering of snow that the day before had made ski running a pleasure was now swept away over great stretches of surface, exposing the hard substratum. Our thoughts flew back. The crampons we had left behind seemed to dance before my eyes, backwards and forwards, grinning and pointing fingers at me. It would be a nice little extra trip back to the butcher's to fetch them. Meanwhile we packed and made everything ready. The tracks of the day before were not easy to follow, but if we lost them now and again on the smooth ice surface, we picked them up later on the snow wave that had resisted the attack of the wind. It was hard and strenuous work for the drivers. The sledges were difficult to manage over the smooth sloping ice. Sometimes they went straight, but just as often crosswise, requiring sharp attention to keep them from capsizing. And this had to be prevented at all costs, as the thin provision cases would not stand many bumps on the ice. Besides which, it was such hard work righting the sledges again that for this reason alone the drivers exercised the greatest care. The sledges were put to a severe test that day, with the many great and hard irregularities we encountered on the glacier. It is a wonder they survived it, and is a good testimonial for Bjalland's work. The glacier that day presented the worst confusion we had yet had to deal with. Hassel and I went in front, as usual, with a rope on. Up to the spot Hanssen and I had reached the evening before, our progress was comparatively easy. One gets on so much quicker when one knows that the way is practicable. After this point it became worse. Indeed, it was often so bad that we had to stop for a long time and try in various directions before finding a way. More than once the axe had to be used to hack away obstructions. At one time things looked really serious. chasm after chasm, hummock after hummock, so high and steep that they were like mountains. Here we went out and explored in every direction to find a passage. At last we found one, if, indeed, it deserved the name of a passage. It was a bridge so narrow that it scarcely allowed room for the width of the sledge, a fearful abyss on each side. The crossing of this place reminded me of the tight-rope walker going over Niagara. It was a good thing none of us was subject to giddiness, and that the dogs did not know exactly what the result of a false step would be. On the other side of this bridge we began to go downhill, and our course now lay in a long valley between lofty undulations on each side. It tried our patience severely to advance here, as the line of the hollow was fairly long and ran due west. We tried several times to lay our course towards the south, and clamber up the side of the undulation, but these efforts did not pay us. We could always get up onto the ridge, but we could not come down again on the other side. There was nothing to be done but to follow the natural course of the valley until it took us into the tract lying to the south. It was especially the drivers whose patience was sorely tried, and I could see them now and then take a turn up to the top of the ridge, not satisfied with the exploration Hassel and I had made. But the result was always the same. They had to submit to nature's caprices and follow in our tracks. Our course along this natural line was not entirely free from obstruction. Crevasses of various dimensions constantly crossed our path. The ridge or undulation, at the top of which we at last arrived, had quite an imposing effect. It terminated on the east in a steep drop to the underlying surface, and attained at this point a height of over 100 feet. On the west it sloped gradually into the lower ground, and allowed us to advance that way. In order to have a better view of the surroundings, we ascended the eastern and highest part of the ridge, and from here we at once had a confirmation of our supposition of the day before. The ridge we had then seen, behind which we hoped to find better conditions, could now be seen a good way ahead. And what we then saw made our hearts beat fast with joy. Could that great white unbroken plain over there be real, or was it only an illusion? Time would show. Meanwhile Hassel and I jogged on, and the others followed. We had to get through a good many difficulties yet before we reached that point, but, compared with all the breakneck places we had already crossed, these were of a comparatively tame description. It was with a sigh of relief that we arrived at the plain that promised so well. Its extent was not very great, but we were not very exacting either in this respect, after our last few days' march over the broken surface. Farther to the south we could still see great masses piled up by pressure, but the intervals between them were very great, and the surface was whole. This was, then, the first time since we tackled the Devil's Glacier that we were able to steer true south for a few minutes. As we progressed, it could be seen that we had really come upon another kind of ground. For once we had not been made fools of. Not that we had an unbroken, level surface to go upon. It would be a long time before we came to that. But we were able to keep our course for long stretches at a time. The huge crevasses became rarer, and so filled up at both ends that we were able to cross them without going a long way round. There was a new life in all of us, both dogs and men, and we went rapidly southward. As we advanced, the conditions improved more and more. We could see in the distance some huge dome-shaped formations that seemed to tower high into the air. These turned out to be the southernmost limit of the big crevasses, and to form the transition to the third phase of the glacier. It was a stiff climb to get up these domes, which were fairly high and swept smooth by the wind. They lay straight in our course, and from their tops we had a good view. The surface we were entering upon was quite different from that on the northern side of the domes. Here the big crevasses were entirely filled with snow, and might be crossed anywhere. What specially attracted one's attention here was an immense number of small formations in the shape of haycocks. Great stretches of the surface were swept bare, exposing the smooth ice. It was evident that these formations or phases in the glacier were due to the underlying ground. The first tract we had passed, where the confusion was so extreme, must be the part that lay nearest the bare land. In proportion as the glacier left the land, it became less disturbed. In the haycock district the disturbance had not produced cracks in the surface to any extent, only upheaval here and there. How these haycocks were formed and what they looked like inside we were soon to find out. It was a pleasure to be able to advance all the time, instead of constantly turning and going round. Only once or twice did we have to turn aside for the larger haycocks, otherwise we kept our course. The great, clean-swept stretches of surface that we came upon from time to time were split in every direction, but the cracks were very narrow, about half an inch wide. We had difficulty in finding a place for the tent that evening. the surface was equally hard everywhere, and at last we had to set it on the bare ice. Luckily for our tent pegs, this ice was not of the bright steely variety. It was more milky in appearance and not so hard, and we were thus able to knock in the pegs with the axe. When the tent was up, Hassel went out as usual to fetch snow for the cooker. As a rule, he performed this task with a big knife, specially made for snow, but this evening he went out armed with an axe. He was very pleased with the abundant and excellent material that lay to his hand. There was no need to go far. Just outside the tent door, 2 feet away, stood a fine little haycock that looked as if it would serve the purpose well. Hassel raised his axe and gave a good sound blow. The axe met with no resistance and went in up to the haft. The haycock was hollow. As the axe was pulled out, the surrounding part gave way, and one could hear the pieces of ice falling down through the dark hole. It appeared then that 2 feet from our door we had a most convenient way down into the cellar. Hassel looked as if he enjoyed the situation. Black as a sack, he smiled. Couldn't see any bottom. Hanssen was beaming. No doubt he would have liked the tent a little nearer. The material provided by the haycock was of the best quality, and well adapted for cooking purposes. The next day, December 1st, was a very fatiguing one for us all. From early morning a blinding blizzard raged from the southeast, with a heavy fall of snow. The going was of the very worst kind, polished ice. I stumbled forward on ski and had comparatively easy work. The drivers had been obliged to take off their ski and put them on the loads so as to walk by the side, support the sledges, and give the dogs help when they came to a difficult place. And that was pretty often, for on this smooth ice surface there were a number of small scattered sastrugi, and these consisted of a kind of snow that reminded one more of fish glue than of anything else when the sledges came in contact with it. The dogs could get no hold with their claws on the smooth ice, and when the sledge came on to one of these tough little waves, they could not manage to haul it over, try as they might. The driver then had to put all his strength into it to prevent the sledge stopping. Thus in most cases the combined efforts of men and dogs carried the sledge on. In the course of the afternoon the surface again began to be more disturbed, and great crevasses crossed our path time after time. These crevasses were really rather dangerous. They looked very innocent, as they were quite filled up with snow, but on a nearer acquaintance with them we came to understand that they were far more hazardous than we dreamt of at first. It turned out that between the loose snow filling and the firm ice edges there was a fairly broad open space, leading straight down into the depths. The layer of snow which covered it over was in most cases quite thin. In driving out into one of these snow-filled crevasses nothing happened as a rule, but it was in getting off on the other side that the critical moment arrived. For here the dogs came up onto the smooth ice surface and could get no hold for their claws, with the result that it was left entirely to the driver to haul the sledge up. The strong pull he then had to give sent him through the thin layer of snow. Under these circumstances he took a good firm hold of the sledge lashing, or of a special strap that had been made with a view of these accidents. But familiarity breeds contempt, even with the most cautious, and some of the drivers were often within an ace of going down into the cellar. If this part of the journey was trying for the dogs, it was certainly no less so for the men. If the weather had even been fine, so that we could have looked about us, we should not have minded it so much, but in this vile weather it was, indeed, no pleasure. Our time was also a good deal taken up with thawing noses and cheeks as they froze. Not that we stopped, we had no time for that. We simply took off a mitt and laid the warm hand on the frozen spot as we went. When we thought we had restored sensation, we put the hand back into the mitt. By this time it would want warming. One does not keep one's hands bare for long, with the thermometer several degrees below zero, and a storm blowing. In spite of the unfavourable conditions we had been working in, the sledge meters that evening showed a distance of 15½ miles. We were well satisfied with the day's work when we camped. Let us cast a glance into the tent this evening. It looks cosy enough. The inner half of the tent is occupied by 3 sleeping bags, whose respective owners have found it both comfortable and expedient to turn in, and may now be seen engaged with their diaries. The outer half, that nearest the door, has only 2 sleeping bags, but the rest of the space is taken up with the whole cooking apparatus of the expedition. The owners of these 2 bags are still sitting up. Hanssen is cook, and will not turn in until the food is ready and served. Wisting is his sworn comrade and assistant, and is ready to lend him any aid that may be required. Hanssen appears to be a careful cook. He evidently does not like to burn the food, and his spoon stirs the contents of the pot incessantly. Soup! The effect of the word is instantaneous. Everyone sits up at once with a cup in one hand and a spoon in the other. Each one in his turn has his cup filled with what looks like the most tasty vegetable soup. Scalding hot it is, as one can see by the faces, but for all that it disappears with surprising rapidity. Again the cups are filled, this time with more solid stuff pemmican. With praiseworthy dispatch their contents are once more demolished, and they are filled for the third time. There is nothing the matter with these men's appetites. The cups are carefully scraped, and the enjoyment of bread and water begins. It is easy to see, too, that it is an enjoyment, greater, to judge by the pleasure on their faces, than the most skilfully devised menu could afford. They positively caress the biscuits before they eat them, and the water, ice-cold water they all call for, this also disappears in great quantities, and procures, I feel certain from their expression, a far greater pleasure and satisfaction than the finest wine that was ever produced. The Primus hums softly during the whole meal, and the temperature in the tent is quite pleasant. When the meal is over, one of them calls for scissors and looking-glass, and then one may see the polar explorers dressing their hair for the approaching Sunday. The beard is cut quite short with a clipper every Saturday evening. This is done not so much from motives of vanity as from considerations of utility and comfort. The beard invites an accumulation of ice, which may often be very embarrassing. A beard in the polar regions seems to me to be just as awkward and unpractical as, well, let us say, walking with a tall hat on each foot. As the beard clipper and the mirror make their round, one after the other disappears into his bag, and with 5 "good nights" silence falls upon the tent. The regular breathing soon announces that the day's work demands its tribute. Meanwhile the southeaster howls, and the snow beats against the tent. The dogs have curled themselves up, and do not seem to trouble themselves about the weather. The storm continued unabated on the following day, and on account of the dangerous nature of the ground, we decided to wait a while. In the course of the morning, towards noon perhaps, the wind dropped a little, and out we went. The sun peeped through at times, and we took the welcome opportunity of getting an altitude. 86 degrees 47 minutes south was the result. At this camp we left behind all our delightful reindeer skin clothing, as we could see that we should have no use for it, the temperature being far too high. We kept the hoods of our reindeer coats, however; we might be glad of them in going against the wind. Our day's march was not to be a long one. The little slackening of the wind about midday was only a joke. It soon came on again in earnest, with a sweeping blizzard from the same quarter, the southeast. If we had known the ground, we should possibly have gone on, but in this storm and driving snow, which prevented our keeping our eyes open, it was no use. A serious accident might happen and ruin all. 2½ miles was therefore our whole distance. The temperature when we camped was –5.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Height above the sea, 9,780 feet. In the course of the night the wind veered from southeast to north, falling light, and the weather cleared. This was a good chance for us, and we were not slow to avail ourselves of it. A gradually rising ice surface lay before us, bright as a mirror. As on the preceding days, I stumbled along in front on ski, while the others, without their ski, had to follow and support the sledges. The surface still offered filled crevasses, though perhaps less frequently than before. Meanwhile small patches of snow began to show themselves on the polished surface, and soon increased in number and size, until before very long they united and covered the unpleasant ice with a good and even layer of snow. Then ski were put on again, and we continued our way to the south with satisfaction. We were all rejoicing that we had now conquered this treacherous glacier, and congratulating ourselves on having at last arrived on the actual plateau. As we were going along, feeling pleased about this, a ridge suddenly appeared right ahead, telling us plainly that perhaps all our sorrows were not yet ended. The ground had begun to sink a little, and as we came nearer we could see that we had to cross a rather wide, but not deep, valley before we arrived under the ridge. Great lines of hummocks and haycock-shaped pieces of ice came in view on every side. We could see that we should have to keep our eyes open. And now we came to the formation in the glacier that we called the Devil's Ballroom. Little by little the covering of snow that we had praised in such high terms disappeared, and before us lay this wide valley, bare and gleaming. At first it went well enough. As it was downhill, we were going at a good pace on the smooth ice. Suddenly Wisting's sledge cut into the surface and turned over on its side. We all knew what had happened. One of the runners was in a crevasse. Wisting set to work, with the assistance of Hassel, to raise the sledge, and take it out of its dangerous position. Meanwhile Bjalland had got out his camera and was setting it up. Accustomed as we were to such incidents, Hanssen and I were watching the scene from a point a little way in advance, where we had arrived when it happened. As the photography took rather a long time, I assumed that the crevasse was one of the filled ones and presented no particular danger, but that Bjalland wanted to have a souvenir among his photographs of the numerous crevasses and ticklish situations we had been exposed to. As to the crack being filled up, there was of course no need to inquire. I hailed them and asked how they were getting on. "Oh, all right," was the answer. "We've just finished." "What does the crevasse look like?" "Oh, as usual," they shouted back. "No bottom." I mention this little incident just to show how one can grow accustomed to anything in this world. There were these two, Wisting and Hassel, lying over a yawning, bottomless abyss, and having their photograph taken. Neither of them gave a thought to the serious side of the situation. To judge from the laughter and jokes we heard, one would have thought their position was something quite different. When the photographer had quietly and leisurely finished his work, he got a remarkably good picture of the scene. The other two together raised the sledge, and the journey was continued. It was at this crevasse that we entered His Majesty's ballroom. The surface did not really look bad. True, the snow was blown away, which made it difficult to advance, but we did not see many cracks. There were a good many pressure masses, as already mentioned, but even in the neighbourhood of these we could not see any marked disturbance. The first sign that the surface was more treacherous than it appeared to be was when Hansen's leading dogs went right through the apparently solid floor. They remained hanging by their harness and were easily pulled up again. When we looked through the hole they had made in the crust, it did not give us the impression of being very dangerous, as, 2 or 3 feet below the outer crust, there lay another surface, which appeared to consist of pulverized ice. We assumed that this lower surface was the solid one, and that therefore there was no danger in falling through the upper one. But Bjalland was able to tell us a different story. He had, in fact, fallen through the outer crust, and was well on his way through the inner one as well, when he got hold of a loop of rope on his sledge and saved himself in the nick of time. Time after time the dogs now fell through, and time after time the men went in. The effect of the open space between the two crusts was that the ground under our feet sounded unpleasantly hollow as we went over it. The drivers whipped up their dogs as much as they could, and with shouts and brisk encouragement they went rapidly over the treacherous floor. Fortunately, this curious formation was not of great extent, and we soon began to observe a change for the better as we came up the ridge. It soon appeared that the ballroom was the glacier's last farewell to us. With it all irregularities ceased, and both surface and going improved by leaps and bounds, so that before very long we had the satisfaction of seeing that at last we had really conquered all these unpleasant difficulties. The surface at once became fine and even, with a splendid covering of snow everywhere, and we went rapidly on our way to the south with a feeling of security and safety. End of Section 25. End of Volume 2, Chapter 11, Through the Mountains.
Section 26 of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ken Campbell. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by E.G. Carter. Section 26, Volume 2, Chapter 12. At the Pole. In latitude 87 degrees south, according to dead reckoning, we saw the last of the land to the northeast. The atmosphere was then apparently as clear as could be, and we felt certain that our view covered all the land there was to be seen from that spot. We were deceived again on this occasion, as will be seen later. Our distance that day, December 4th, was close upon 25 miles. Height above sea, 10,100 feet. The weather did not continue fine for long. Next day, December 5th, there was a gale from the north, and once more the whole plain was a mass of drifting snow. In addition to this, there was thick falling snow, which blinded us and made things worse. But a feeling of security had come over us and helped us to advance rapidly and without hesitation, although we could see nothing. That day we encountered new surface conditions, big, hard snow waves, sastrugi. They were anything but pleasant to work among, especially when one could not see them. It was of no use for us forerunners to think of going in advance under these circumstances, as it was impossible to keep on one's feet. 3 or 4 paces was often the most we managed to do before falling down. The sastrugi were very high and often abrupt. If one came upon them unexpectedly, one required to be more than an acrobat to keep on one's feet. The plan we found worked best in these conditions was to let Hansen's dog go first. This was an unpleasant job for Hansen and for his dogs too, but it succeeded, and succeeded well. An upset here and there was, of course, unavoidable, but with a little patience the sledge always righted again. The drivers had as much as they could do to support their sledges among these sastrugi, but while supporting the sledges, they had at the same time a support for themselves. It was worse for us who had no sledges, but by keeping in the wake of them we could see where the irregularities lay, and thus got over them. Hansen deserves a special word of praise for his driving on this surface in such weather. It is a difficult matter to drive Eskimo dogs forward when they cannot see, but Hansen managed it well, both getting the dogs on and steering his course by compass. One would not think it possible to keep an approximate right course, when the uneven ground gives such violent shocks that the needle flies several times round the compass, and is no sooner still again than it recommences the same dance. But when at last we got an observation, it turned out that Hansen had steered to a hair, for the observation and dead reckoning agreed to a mile. In spite of all hindrances, and of being able to see nothing, the sledge meter showed nearly 25 miles. The hypsometer showed 11,070 feet above the sea. We had therefore reached a greater altitude than the butchers. December 6 brought the same weather. Thick snow, sky, and plain all one. Nothing to be seen. Nevertheless, we made splendid progress. The sastrugi gradually became leveled out until the surface was perfectly smooth. It was a relief to have even ground to go upon once more. These irregularities that one was constantly falling over were a nuisance. If we had met with them in our usual surroundings, it would not have mattered so much. But up here on the high ground, where we had to stand and gasp for every breath every time we rolled over, it was certainly not pleasant. That day we passed 88 degrees south and camped in 88 degrees 9 minutes south. A great surprise awaited us in the tent that evening. I expected to find, as on the previous evening, that the boiling point had fallen somewhat. In other words, that it would show a continued rise of the ground. But to our astonishment, this was not so. The water boiled at exactly the same temperature as on the preceding day. I tried it several times to convince myself that there was nothing wrong, each time with the same result. There was great rejoicing among us all when I was able to announce that we had arrived on top of the plateau. December 7th began like the 6th, with absolutely thick weather. But as they say, you never know what the day is like before sunset. Possibly I might have chosen a better expression than this last, one more in agreement with the natural conditions, but I'll let it stand. Though for several weeks now the sun had not set, my readers will not be so critical as to reproach me with inaccuracy. With a light wind from the northeast, we now went southward at a good speed over the perfectly level plain, with excellent going. The uphill work had taken it out of our dogs, though not to any serious extent. They had turned greedy, there's no denying that, and the half-kilo of pemmican they got each day was not enough to fill their stomachs. Early and late they were looking for something, no matter what, to devour. To begin with, they contented themselves with such loose objects as ski bindings, whips, boots, and the like. But as we came to know their proclivities, we took such care of everything that they found no extra meals lying about. But that was not the end of the matter. They then went for the fixed lashings of the sledges, and, if we had allowed it, they would very quickly have resolved the various sledges into their component parts. But we found a way of stopping that. Every evening on halting the sledges, they were buried in the snow, so as to hide all the lashings. That was successful. Curiously enough, they never tried to force the snow rampart. I may mention as a curious thing that these ravenous animals that devoured everything they came across, even to the ebonite points of our ski sticks, never made any attempt to break into the provision cases. They lay there and went about among the sledges with their nose just on the level of the split cases, seeing and scenting the pemmican, without once making a sign of taking any. But if one raised the lid, they were not long in showing themselves. Then they all came in a great hurry and flocked about the sledges in hope of getting a little bit extra. I am at a loss to explain this behavior. That bashfulness was not at the root of it, I am tolerably certain. During the forenoon the thick gray curtain of cloud began to grow thinner on the horizon, and for the first time for 3 days we could see a few miles about us. The feeling was something like that one has on waking from a good nap, rubbing one's eyes and looking around. We'd become so accustomed to the gray twilight that this positively dazzled us. Meanwhile, the upper layer of air seemed obstinately to remain the same, and to be doing its best to prevent the sun from showing itself. We badly wanted to get a meridian altitude so that we could determine our latitude. Since 86 degrees 47 minutes south, we had had no observation, and it was not easy to say when we should get one. Hitherto, the weather conditions on the high ground had not been particularly favorable. Although the prospects were not very promising, we halted at 11 a.m. and made ready to catch the sun if it should be kind enough to look out. Hansel and Wisting used one sextant and artificial horizon. Hansen and I the other set. I don't know that I had ever stood and absolutely pulled at the sun to get it out as much as I did that time. If we got an observation here which agreed with our reckoning, then it would be possible, if the worst came to the worst, to go to the pole on dead reckoning. But if we got none now, it was a question whether our claim to the pole would be admitted on the dead reckoning we should be able to produce. Whether my pulling helped or not, it is certain that the sun appeared. It was not very brilliant to begin with, but practiced as we now were in availing ourselves to even the poorest chances, it was good enough. Down it came. It was checked by all and the altitude written down. The curtain of cloud was rent more and more, and before we had finished our work, that is to say, caught the sun at its highest, and convinced ourselves that it was descending again, it was shining in all its glory. We had put away our instruments and were sitting on the sledges engaged in the calculations. I can safely say that we were excited. What would the result be, after marching blindly for so long over such impossible ground as we had been doing? We added and subtracted, and at last there was the result. We looked at each other in sheer incredulity. The result was as astonishing as the most consummate conjuring trick. 88 degrees 16 minutes south, precisely to the minute the same as our reckoning, 88 degrees 16 minutes south. If we were forced to go to the pole on dead reckoning, then surely the most exacting would admit our right to do so. We put away our observation books, ate 1 or 2 biscuits, and went at it again. We had a great piece of work before us that day, nothing less than carrying our flag farther south than the foot of man had trod. We had our silk flag ready. It was made fast to 2 ski sticks and laid on Hansen's sledge. I had given him orders that as soon as we had covered the distance to 88 degrees south, which was Shackleton's farthest south, the flag was to be hoisted on the sledge. It was my turn as the forerunner, and I pushed on. There was no longer any difficulty in holding one's course. I had the grandest cloud formations to steer by, and everything now went like a machine. First came the forerunner, for the time being, then Hansen and Wisting, and finally Bjalland. The forerunner, who was not on duty, went where he liked. As a rule, he accompanied one or other of the sledges. I had long ago fallen into a reverie, far removed from the scene in which I was moving. What I thought about I do not remember now, but I was so preoccupied that I had entirely forgotten my surroundings. Then suddenly I was roused from my dreaming by a jubilant shout, followed by ringing cheers. I turned round quickly to discover the reason for this unwonted occurrence, and stood speechless and overcome. I find it impossible to express the feelings that possessed me at this moment. All the sledges had stopped, and from the foremost of them the Norwegian flag was flying. It shook itself out, waved, and flapped so that the silk rustled. It looked wonderfully well in the pure, clean, and shining white surroundings. 88 degrees 23 minutes was past. We were farther south than any human being had been. No other moment of the whole trip affected me like this. The tears forced their ways to my eyes, but no effort of will could keep them back. It was the flag yonder that conquered me and my will. Luckily, I was some way in advance of the others, so that I had time to pull myself together and master my feelings before reaching my comrades. We all shook hands with mutual congratulations. We had won our way far by holding together, and we would go farther yet to the end. We did not pass that spot without according the highest tribute of admiration to the man who, together with his gallant companions, had planted his country's flag so infinitely nearer to the goal than any of his precursors. Sir Ernest Shackleton's name will always be written in the annals of Antarctic exploration in letters of fire. Pluck and grit can work wonders, and I know of no better example of this than what that man has accomplished. The cameras, of course, came out, and we got an excellent photograph of the scene, which none of us will ever forget. We went a couple miles more to 88 degrees 25 minutes, then camped. The weather had improved and kept on improving all the time. It was now almost perfectly calm, radiantly clear, and, under the circumstances, quite summer-like, minus 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the tent it was quite sultry. This was more than we had expected. After much consideration and discussion, we had come to the conclusion that we ought to lay down a depot, the last one at this spot. The advantages of lightening our sledges were so great that we should have to risk it. Nor would there be any great risk attached to it, after all, since we should adopt a system of marks that would lead even a blind man back to the place. We had determined to mark it not only at right angles to our course, that is, from east to west, but by snow beacons at every 2 geographical miles to the south. We stayed here on the following day to arrange this depot. Hansen's dogs were really marvels, all of them. Nothing seemed to have any effect on them. They had grown rather thinner, of course, but they were still as strong as ever. It was therefore decided not to lighten Hansen's sledge, but only the 2 others. Both Wisting's and Bjalland's teams had suffered, especially the latter's. The reduction in weight that was effected was considerable, nearly 110 pounds on each of the 2 sledges. There was thus about 220 pounds in the depot. The snow here was ill adapted for building, but we put up quite a respectable monument all the same. It was dogs' pemmican and biscuits that we left behind. We carried with us on the sledges provisions for about a month. If, therefore, contrary to expectation, we should be so unlucky as to miss the depot, we should nevertheless be fairly sure of reaching our depot at 86 degrees 21 minutes before the supplies ran short. The cross markings on the depot were done with 60 splinters of black packing case on each side, with 100 paces between each. Every other one had a shred of black cloth on the top. The splinters on the east side were all marked, so that on seeing them we should know instantly that we were to the east of the depot. Those on the west had no marks. The warmth of the past few days seemed to have matured our frost sores, and we presented an awful appearance. It was Wisting, Hansen, and I who suffered the worst damage in the last southeast blizzard. The left side of our faces was one mass of sore, bathed in matter and serum. We looked like the worst types of tramps and ruffians, and would probably not have been recognized by our nearest relations. These sores were a great trouble to us during the latter part of the journey. The slightest gust of wind produced a sensation, as if one's face were being cut backwards and forwards with a blunt knife. They lasted a long time, too. I can remember Hansen removing his last scab when we were coming into Hobart 3 months later. We were very lucky in the weather during this depot work. The sun came out all at once, and we had an excellent opportunity of taking some good azimuth observations, the last of any use that we got on the journey. December 9th arrived with the same fine weather and sunshine. True, we felt our frost sores rather sharply that day, with minus 18.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and a little breeze dead against us, but that could not be helped. We at once began to put up beacons, a work which was continued with great regularity right up to the pole. These beacons were not so big as those we had built down on the barrier. We could see that they would be quite large enough, with a height of about 3 feet. As it was, very easy to see the slightest irregularities on this perfect flat surface. While thus engaged, we had an opportunity of becoming thoroughly acquainted with the nature of the snow. Often, very often indeed, on this part of the plateau, to the south, 88 degrees 25 minutes, we had difficulty in getting snow good enough, that is, solid enough for cutting blocks. The snow up here seemed to have fallen very quickly, in light breezes or calms. We could thrust the tent pole, which was 6 feet long, right down without meeting resistance, which showed that there was no hard layer of snow. The surface was also perfectly level. There was not a sign of sastrugi in any direction. Every step we now took in advance brought us rapidly nearer the goal. We could feel fairly certain of reaching it on the afternoon of the 14th. It was very natural that our conversation should be chiefly concerned with the time of arrival. None of us would admit that he was nervous, but I am inclined to think that we all had a little touch of this malady. What should we see when we get there? A vast, endless plain that no eye had yet seen, or no foot had trodden? Or no, it was an impossibility. With the speed at which we traveled, we must reach the goal first. There could be no doubt about it. And yet, whenever there is the smallest loophole, doubt creeps in and gnaws and never leaves a poor wretch in peace. What on earth is ascenting? It was Bjalland who made this remark on one of the last days, when I was going by the side of his sledge and talking with him. And the strange thing is that he scented to the south. It can never be. Miles, Ring, and Suggen showed the same interest in the southerly direction. It was quite extraordinary to see how they raised their heads with every sign of curiosity, put their noses to the air, and sniffed due south. One would really have thought there was something remarkable to be found there. From 88 degrees 25 minutes south, the barometer and the hypsometer indicated slowly but surely that the plateau was beginning to descend towards the other side. This was a pleasant surprise to us. We had thus not only found the very summit of the plateau, but also the slope down on the far side. This would have a very important bearing for obtaining an idea of the construction of the whole plateau. On December 9th, observations and dead reckoning agreed within a mile. The same result was on the 10th. Observation 2 kilometers behind reckoning. The weather and going remained about the same as on the preceding days. Light southeasterly breeze, temperature minus 18.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow surface was loose, but the ski and the sledges glided over it well. On the 11th, the same weather conditions, temperature minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. Observation and reckoning again agreed exactly. Our latitude was 89 degrees, 15 minutes south. On the 12th, we reached 89 degrees, 30 minutes, reckoning 1 kilometer behind observation. Going and surface was as good as ever. Weather splendid, calm with sunshine. The noon observation on the 13th gave 89 degrees, 37 minutes south. Reckoning 89 degrees, 38.5 minutes south. We had halted in the afternoon after going 8 geographical miles, and camped in 89 degrees 45 minutes, according to reckoning. The weather during the forenoon had been just as fine as before. In the afternoon we had some snow showers from the southeast. It was like the eve of some great festival that night in the tent. One could feel that a great event was at hand. Our flag was taken out again and lashed to the same 2 ski sticks as before. Then it was rolled up and laid aside, to be ready when the time came. I was awake several times during the night, and had the same feeling that I can remember as a little boy on the night before Christmas Eve, an intense expectation of what was going to happen. Otherwise, I think we slept just as well that night as any other. On the morning of December 14th, the weather was of its finest, just as if it had been made for arriving at the pole. I am not quite sure, but I believe we dispatched our breakfast rather more quickly than usual, and were out of the tent sooner, though I must admit that we always accomplished this with all reasonable haste. We went in the usual order, the forerunner, Hansen, Wisting, Bjalland, and the reserve forerunner. By noon we had reached 89 degrees 53 minutes by dead reckoning, and made ready to take the rest in one stage. At 10 a.m. a light breeze had sprung up from the southeast, and it had clouded over so that we got no noon altitude. But the clouds were not thick, and from time to time we had a glimpse of the sun through them. The going on that day was rather different from what it had been. Sometimes the ski went over it well, but others it was pretty bad. We advanced that day in the same mechanical way as before. Not much was said, but eyes were used all the more. Hansen's neck grew twice as long as before in his endeavor to see a few inches farther. I'd asked him before we started to spy out ahead for all he was worth, and he did so with a vengeance. But however keenly he stared, he could not descry anything but the endless flat plain ahead of us. The dogs had dropped their scenting and appeared to have lost their interest in the regions about the Earth's axis. At 3 in the afternoon, a simultaneous halt rang out from the drivers. They had carefully examined their sledge meters, and they all showed the full distance, our pole, by reckoning. The goal was reached, the journey ended. I cannot say, though as I know it would sound much more effective, that the object of my life was obtained. That would be romancing rather too barefacedly. I had better be honest and admit straight out that I have never known any man to be placed in such a diametrically opposite position to the goal of his desires as I was at that moment. The regions around the North Pole, yes, the North Pole itself, had attracted me from childhood, and here I was at the South Pole. Can anything be more topsy-turvy be imagined? We reckoned now that we were at the pole. Of course, every one of us knew that we were not standing on the absolute spot. It would be an impossibility with the time and instruments at our disposal to ascertain the exact spot. But we were so near it that a few miles which possibly separated us from it could not be of the slightest importance. It was our intention to make a circle around this camp with a radius of 12.5 miles, 20 kilometers, and to be satisfied with that. After we had halted, we collected and congratulated each other. We had good grounds for mutual respect in what had been achieved, and I think that was just the feeling that was expressed in the firm and powerful grasps of the fists that were exchanged. After this we proceeded to the greatest and most solemn act of the whole journey, the planting of our flag. Pride and affection shone in the 5 pairs of eyes that gazed upon the flag as it unfurled itself with a sharp crack and waved over the pole. I had determined that the act of planting it, the historic event, should be equally divided among us. It was not for one man to do this. It was for all who had staked their lives in the struggle and held together through thick and thin. This was the only way in which I could show my gratitude to my comrades in this desolate spot. I could see that they understood and accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. 5 weather-beaten, frost-bitten fists they were, grasped the pole, raised the waving flag in the air, and planted it as the first at the geographical South Pole. Thus we plant thee, beloved flag, at the South Pole, and give to the plain on which it lies the name of King Haakon VII's plateau. That moment will certainly be remembered by all of us who stood there. One gets out of the way of protracted ceremonies in those regions. The shorter they are, the better. Everyday life began again at once. When we had gotten the tent up, Hansen set about slaughtering Helgi, and it was hard for him to have to part from his best friend. Helgi had been an uncommonly useful and good-natured dog. Without making any fuss, he had pulled from morning to night, and it had been a shining example to the team. But during the last week he had quite fallen away, and on our arrival at the pole there was only a shadow of the old Helgi left. He was only a drag on the others, and did absolutely no work. One blow on the skull and Helgi had ceased to live. What is death to one is food to another, is a saying that can scarcely find a better application than these dog meals. Helgi was portioned out on the spot, and within a couple of hours there was nothing left of him but teeth and the turf at the end of his tail. This was the second of our 18 dogs that we had lost. The Major, one of Wisting's fine dogs, left us at 88 degrees 25 minutes south, and never returned. He was fearfully worn out, and must have gone away to die. We now had 16 dogs left, and these were intended to divide into 2 equal teams, leaving Bjalland's sled behind. Of course there was festivity in the tent that evening. Not that champagne corks were popping and wine flowing. No, we contented ourselves with a little piece of seal meat each, and it tasted well and did us good. There was no other sign of festival indoors. Outside we heard the flag flapping in the breeze. Conversation was lively in the tent that evening, as we talked of many things. Perhaps, too, our thoughts sent messages home of what we had done. Everything we had with us now had to be marked with the words South Pole, and the date to serve afterwards as souvenirs. Wisting proved to be a first-class engraver, and many were the articles he had to mark. Tobacco, in the form of smoke, and hitherto never made its appearance in the tent. From time to time I had seen one or two of the others take a quid, but now these things were to be altered. I had brought with me an old briar pipe which bore inscriptions from the many places in the Arctic regions, and now I wanted it marked South Pole. When I produced the pipe and was about to mark it, I received an unexpected gift. Wisting offered me tobacco for the rest of the journey. He had some cakes of plug in his kit bag, which he would prefer to see me smoke. Can anyone grasp what such an offer meant at such a spot, made to a man who, to tell you the truth, is very fond of a smoke after meals? There are not many who can understand it fully. I accepted the offer, jumping with joy, and on the way home I had a pipe of fresh, fine-cut plug every evening. Ah, that Wisting! He spoiled me entirely. Not only did he give me tobacco, but every evening, and I must confess I yielded to the temptation after a while, and had a morning smoke as well. He undertook the disagreeable work of cutting the plug and filling my pipe in all kinds of weather. But we did not let our talk make us forget other things. As we had got no noon altitude, we should have to try and take one at midnight. The weather had brightened again, and it looked as if midnight would be a good time for the observation. We therefore crept into our bags to get a little nap in the intervening hours. In good time, soon after 11 p.m., we were out again, and ready to catch the sun. The weather was of the best, and the opportunity excellent. We four navigators all had a share in it, as usual, and stood watching the course of the sun. This was a labor of patience, as the difference of altitude was now very slight, the result of which we finally arrived was of great interest, as it clearly shows how unreliable and valueless a single observation like this is in these regions. At 12:30 a.m. we put our instruments away, well satisfied with our work and quite convinced that it was the midnight altitude that we had observed. The calculations which were carried out immediately afterwards gave us 89 degrees 56 minutes south. We were all well pleased with this result. The arrangement now was that we should encircle this camp with a radius of about 12.5 miles. By encircling it, I do not, of course, mean that we should go round in a circle with this radius. That would have taken us days, and was not to be thought of. The encircling was accomplished in this way. 3 men went out in 3 different directions, 2 at right angles to the course we had been steering, and 1 in continuation of that course. To carry out this work I had chosen Wisting, Hansel, and Bjalland. Having concluded our observations, we put the kettle on to give ourselves a drop of chocolate. The pleasure of standing out there in rather light attire had not exactly put warmth into our bodies. As we were engaged in swallowing the scalding drink, Bjalland suddenly observed, "I'd like to tackle this encircling straight away. We shall have lots of time to sleep when we get back." Hansel and Wisting were quite of the same opinion, and it was agreed that they should start the work immediately. Here we have yet another example of the good spirit that prevailed in our little community. We had only lately come in from our day's work, a march of about 18.5 miles, and now they were asking to be allowed to go another 25 miles. It seemed as if these fellows could never be tired. We therefore turned this meal into a little breakfast. That is to say, each man ate what he wanted of his bread ration, and then began to get ready for the work. First, 3 small bags of light windproof stuff were made, and in each of these was placed a paper giving the position of our camp. In addition, each of them carried a large square flag of the same dark brown material, which could be easily seen at a distance. As flag poles, we elected to use our spare sledge runners, which were both long, 12 feet, and strong, at which we were going to take off here in any case to lighten the sledges as much as possible for a return journey. Thus equipped, and with 30 biscuits as an extra ration, the 3 men started off in the directions laid down. Their march was by no means free of danger, and does great honor to those who undertook it, not merely without raising the smallest objection, but with the greatest keenness. Let us consider for a moment the risk they ran. Our tent on the boundless plain without marks of any kind may very well be compared with a needle in a haystack. From this the 3 men were to steer out for a distance of 12.5 miles. Compasses would have been a good thing to take on such a walk, but our sledge compasses were too heavy and unsuitable for carrying. They therefore had to go without. They had the sun to go by, certainly, when they started, but who could say how long that would last? The weather was then fine enough, but it was impossible to guarantee that no sudden change would take place. If by bad luck the sun should be hidden, then their own tracks might help them. But to trust the tracks in these regions is a dangerous thing. Before you know where you are, the whole plain may be one mass of driving snow, obliterating the tracks as soon as they are made. With the rapid changes of weather we had so often experienced, such a thing was not impossible. That these three risked their lives that morning when they left the tent at 2:30, there can be no doubt at all. And they all three knew it very well. But if anyone thinks, on this account, they took a solemn farewell of us who stayed behind, he is much mistaken. Not a bit. They all vanished in their different directions amid laughter and chaff. The first thing we did, Hansen and I, was to set about arranging a lot of trifling matters. There was something to be done here, something there, and above all we had to be ready for the series of observations we were to carry out together, so as to get as accurate a determination of our position as possible. The first observation told us at once how necessary this was. For it turned out that this, instead of giving us a greater altitude than the midnight observation, gave us a smaller one, and it was clear that we had gone out of the meridian we thought we were following. Now the first thing to be done was to get our north and south line and latitude determined, so that we could find our position once more. Luckily for us, the weather looked as if it would hold. We measured the sun's altitude every hour from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., and from these observations found with some degree of certainty our latitude and direction of the meridian. By 9 in the morning we began to expect the return of our comrades. According to our calculations, they should then have covered the distance, 25 miles. It was not till 10 o'clock that Hansen made out the first black dot on the horizon, and not long after the second and third appeared. We both gave a sigh of relief as they came on. Almost simultaneously the three arrived at the tent. We told them the result of our observations up to that time. It looked as if our camp was in about 89 degrees 54 minutes and 30 seconds south, and that with our encircling we had therefore included the actual pole. With this result we might have been content, but as the weather was so good and gave the impression that it would continue so, and our store of provisions proved on examination to be very ample, we decided to go on for the remaining 10 kilometers, 5.5 geographical miles, and get our position determined as near to the pole as possible. Meanwhile the three wanderers turned in, not so much because they were tired, as because it was the right thing to do, and Hansen and I continued the series of observations. In the afternoon we again went very carefully through our provision supply before discussing the future. The result was that we had food enough for ourselves and the dogs for 18 days. The surviving 16 dogs were divided into 2 teams of 8 each, and the contents of Bjalland's sled were shared between Hansen's and Wisting's. The abandoned sledge was set upright in the snow, and proved to be a splendid mark. The sledge meter was screwed to the sledge, and we left it there. Our other 2 were quite sufficient for the return journey. They had all shown themselves very accurate. A couple of empty provision cases were also left behind. I wrote in pencil on a piece of the case the information that our tent, Polheim, would be found 5.5 geographical miles northwest quarter, west by compass from the sledge. Having put all these things in order the same day, we turned in, very well satisfied. Early next morning, December 16th, we were on our feet again. Bjalland, who had now left the company of the drivers, had been received with jubilation into that of the forerunners, was immediately entrusted with the honorable task of leading the expedition forward to the pole itself. I assigned this duty, which we all regarded as a distinction to him, as a mark of gratitude to the gallant telemarkers for their preeminent work in the advancement of ski sport. The leader that day had to keep as straight as a line, and if possible to follow the direction of our meridian. A little way after Bjalland came Hansel, then Hansen, then Wisting, and I followed a good way behind. I could thus check the direction of the march very accurately, and see that no great deviation was made. Bjalland on this occasion showed himself a matchless forerunner. He went perfectly straight the whole time. Not once did he incline to one side or the other, and when we arrived at the end of the distance, we could still clearly see the sledge we had set up and take its bearing. This showed it to be absolutely in the right direction. It was 11 a.m. when we reached our destination. While some of us were putting up the tent, others began to get everything ready for the coming observations. A solid snow pedestal was put up on which the artificial horizon was to be placed, and a smaller one to rest the sextant on when it was not in use. At 11:30 a.m. the first observation was taken. We divided ourselves into two parties, Hansen and I in one, Hansel and Wisting in the other. While one party slept, the other took observations, and the watches were of 6 hours each. The weather was altogether grand, though the sky was not perfectly bright the whole time. The very light, fine, vaporous curtain would spread across the sky from time to time, and then quickly disappear again. This film of cloud was not thick enough to hide the sun, which we could see the whole time, but the atmosphere seemed to be disturbed. The effect of this was that the sun appeared not to change its altitude for several hours, until it suddenly made a jump. Observations were now taken every hour through the whole 24. It was very strange to turn in at 6 p.m., and then on turning out again at midnight to find the sun apparently still at the same altitude, and then once more at 6 a.m. to see it still no higher. The altitude had changed, of course, but so slightly that it was imperceptible with the naked eye. To us it appeared as though the sun made the circuit of the heavens at exactly the same altitude. The times of the day that I have given here are calculated according to the meridian of the Frostbite. We continued to reckon our time from this. The observations soon told us that we were not on the absolute pole, but as close to it as we could hope to get with our instruments. The observations which have been submitted to Mr. Anton Alexander will be published, and the results given later in this book. On December 17th at noon we had completed our observation, and it is certain that we had done all that could be done. In order, if possible, to come a few inches nearer to the actual pole, Hansen and Bjalland went out 4 geographical miles in the direction of the newly found meridian. Bjalland astonished me at dinner that day. Speeches had not hitherto been a feature of this journey, but now Bjalland evidently thought the time had come, and surprised us all with a really fine oration. My amazement reached its culmination when, at the conclusion of his speech, he produced a cigar case full of cigars and offered it round. The cigar at the pole. What do you say to that? But it did not end there. When the cigars had gone round, there were still 4 left. I was quite touched when he handed the case of cigars to me with the words, "Keep this to remind you of the pole." I have taken good care of that case, and shall preserve it as one of the many happy signs of my comrades' devotion on this journey. The cigars I shared out afterwards, on Christmas Eve, and they gave us a visible mark of that occasion. When this festival dinner at the pole was ended, we began our preparations for departure. First we set up the little tent we had brought with us in case we should be compelled to divide into 2 parties. It had been made by our able sailmaker Ani, and was of very thin, wind-proof gabardine. Its drab color made it easily visible against the white surface. Another pole was lashed to the tent pole, making its total height about 13 feet. On the top of this, a little Norwegian flag was lashed fast, and underneath it a pennant on which Fram was painted. The tent was well secured with guy ropes on all sides. Inside the tent, in a little bag, I left a letter addressed to H.M., the King, giving information on what we had accomplished. The way home was a long one, and so many things might happen to make it impossible for us to give an account of our expedition. Besides this letter, I wrote a short epistle to Captain Scott, who I assumed would be the first to find the tent. Other things we left there were a sextant with a glass horizon, a hypsometer case, 3 reindeer skin foot bags, some hammocks and mitts. When everything had been laid inside, we went into the tent, one by one, to write our names on a tablet we had fastened to the tent pole. On this occasion we received the congratulations of our companions on the successful result, for the following messages were written on a couple of strips of leather sewn to the tent. "Good luck, and welcome to 90 degrees. These good wishes, which we suddenly discovered, put us in very good spirits. They were signed by Beck and Ronnie. They had good faith in us. When we had finished this we came out, and the tent door was securely laced together, so that there was no danger of the wind getting a hold on that side. And so good-bye to Polheim. It was a solemn moment when we bared our heads and bade farewell to our home and our flag, and then the travelling tent was taken down and the sledges packed. Now the homeward journey was to begin, homeward, step by step, mile after mile, until the whole distance was accomplished. We drove at once into the old tracks and followed them. Many were the times we turned to send a last look at Polheim. The vaporous white air set in again, and it was not long before the last of Polheim, our little flag, disappeared from view. End of section 26, end of volume 2, chapter 12, At the Pole. Recorded by Ken Campbell.